The cabin lights glowed faintly as the plane cruised above the clouds. Passengers whispered softly, scrolling through phones, adjusting pillows, settling into the rhythm of a long flight. Somewhere near the middle rows, a little girl no older than 8 tugged gently at her mother's sleeve. Her small voice was barely louder than the hum of the engines. "Mommy, I'm cold." Her mother nodded, brushing her hand against her daughter's arm, which was covered only by a thin sweater. She pressed the call button, waiting patiently until a uniformed flight attendant arrived. With a polite smile, the mother asked, "Excuse me, could my daughter please have a blanket?" The attendant's smile faltered, just for a second, before she leaned closer. Her tone was sharp, flat, stripped of warmth. "We don't have any extra blankets. She'll be fine." The words cut through the air like a blade. The mother blinked, surprised. She'd traveled before. She knew airlines always carried spares. Around them, a couple of nearby passengers raised their eyebrows. Still calm, the mother tried again. "She's just a child. She's cold. If you could please." The attendant's voice hardened, loud enough for others to hear now. "I said we don't hand out extras. Especially not to people who don't book premium seats." The emphasis on people lingered like smoke in the air. The little girl shrank into her seat, eyes wide, her small hands gripping the armrest. The mother's cheeks flushed with embarrassment. She could feel the weight of eyes on her, some sympathetic, others curious, a few indifferent. Passengers shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke. The cabin's silence became its own accomplice. The attendant didn't move to help, didn't soften her tone, didn't even pretend to care. She simply turned on her heel and walked away, leaving the little girl shivering and the mother biting her lip to keep her composure. The injustice was subtle enough to be denied, but sharp enough to wound deeply. A blanket wasn't just fabric, it was care, compassion, dignity. And tonight, it was withheld like a weapon. No one yet realized that this small act of cruelty was about to unravel into something much bigger. Because somewhere on this very plane, the girl's father was watching. And the call he would make in just a few minutes would shake the cabin, and the airline, to its core. The little girl curled into her mother's side, pulling her thin sweater tighter, but it did little to stop the cold air seeping from the overhead vents. She didn't complain, she just shivered quietly. That silence was what hurt her mother most. Children weren't supposed to hold back like that. The mother placed her own jacket over the child's shoulders. It wasn't thick enough, but it was all she could give. She kissed her daughter's forehead and whispered, "It's okay, baby. We'll be home soon." But the words rang hollow, more for comfort than truth. Across the aisle, a businessman glanced over. He hesitated, then looked away. A young couple in the row behind exchanged uneasy glances. They'd heard every word. They knew blankets were stacked in the galley just a few feet away. But fear kept their lips sealed. Fear of making a scene. Fear of challenging authority. Fear of being labeled troublemakers. This was the unspoken weight of systemic bias. It didn't always arrive in shouts or slurs. Sometimes it came dressed in a uniform, with a smile that hid contempt, with rules enforced selectively depending on who was asking. For the little girl, though, the injustice wasn't abstract. It was cold. It was visible. It was the way her request for something simple, something every other child might receive without hesitation, had been denied because of who she was. Her mother's eyes stayed fixed on the back of the attendant who had walked away so briskly. She wanted to stand, to argue, to demand answers. But she also knew how fragile these moments could be. One wrong word, and the situation could spiral. Black families knew this balance all too well, the tightrope between asserting dignity and avoiding escalation in a world that often twisted dignity into defiance. The plane rumbled softly, pressing forward into the night sky. The little girl's breath fogged faintly against the window as she leaned her head against the glass. She didn't say a word, but her silence spoke louder than any outcry could. Around them, tension rippled. Passengers felt the cruelty but didn't know how to respond. Whispers stirred. One passenger muttered, "Why wouldn't they just give her a blanket?" Another shook his head, staring down at his lap. And in that heavy silence, the power dynamic seemed absolute. The attendant had spoken. The decision was final. The child's comfort and dignity were disposable. Or so it seemed. Because a secret lingered in the cabin, hidden from the flight crew. The girl's father was on this very plane. Not in first class, not flaunting his status, but sitting quietly, unassumingly, a few rows away. He had seen it all, the cold refusal, the humiliation, the way his daughter had been made to feel invisible. He hadn't intervened yet. Not because he didn't care. Not because he didn't notice. But because he was a man who understood the value of timing. He knew when silence spoke louder than protest, and when action could carry the weight of a thunderclap. And in just a few minutes, his voice would break the silence in a way no one on board could ignore. Passengers would gasp. The crew would freeze. And the story of one little girl's blanket would transform into a lesson on dignity, justice, and power. The blanket wasn't just a blanket anymore. It was a symbol. And what happened next would prove that symbols can topple arrogance in an instant. She moved through the narrow aisles with the sharp precision of someone who believed she owned the space. The name on her badge read Karen L. A name that had surfaced more than once in quiet conversations among passengers who traveled often on this airline. She was efficient, yes. Experienced, yes. But she carried herself with a certain superiority, a pride that often crossed into disdain when she thought no one important was watching. Karen had been with the airline for over 15 years. In that time, she had collected more than just flight miles. She had collected complaints, small ones, isolated, always dismissed by management as misunderstandings. Passengers described her as short-tempered, curt, condescending. Others had used harsher words. Rude, disrespectful, biased. But complaints rarely stuck in an industry that valued seniority and appearances. Karen had mastered the art of performing warmth when supervisors were near, then snapping the mask shut when she thought she could get away with it. To her, authority wasn't about service. It was about control. And tonight, when the little black girl asked for a blanket, Karen saw more than a child in need. She saw a chance to assert dominance. It wasn't always obvious, the way prejudice seeped into her actions. She didn't shout slurs. She didn't raise her hand. She didn't make a scene. Instead, her cruelty was wrapped in policy. In rules. In a voice dripping with condescension. We don't hand out extras to people like you. Those words weren't written in any employee handbook. They came from something deeper, something she'd carried for years. Maybe it was resentment. Maybe it was a worldview passed down from whispers in her childhood home. Maybe it was the bitterness of someone who believed the world owed her obedience. To Karen, hierarchy mattered. And on a plane, the uniform gave her the illusion of power she rarely felt elsewhere. When she walked down that aisle, she believed she was the gatekeeper of comfort, the arbiter of who deserved kindness and who didn't. Passengers had seen glimpses of this before. A young Latino man once recalled how she'd scolded him for speaking Spanish too loudly on a flight. An elderly black woman had quietly complained to another attendant after Karen forgot her drink order 3 times in a row. These stories were fragments, scattered across flights, never pieced together into a pattern. Until now. Because this time, Karen hadn't just denied a drink order or ignored a passenger's request. She had humiliated a child. And humiliation cuts deeper when it's aimed at innocence. She thought no one would challenge her. That was the comfort of arrogance. It convinced her she was untouchable. She didn't know the father was sitting only a few rows away. She didn't know the passengers around her were already whispering, their phones quietly recording. She didn't know this flight would become the breaking point where all her masks would shatter. And perhaps, deep down, she didn't care. As she walked back toward the galley, she smirked faintly, believing she had put the family in their place. That single gesture, a blanket withheld, was, to her, a reminder of who held power in this cabin. But arrogance has a way of setting its own trap. The higher you climb on self-importance, the further you have to fall. And Karen's fall was coming. Because when the father finally rose from his seat, her carefully constructed facade of control would collapse in front of an entire plane full of witnesses. And for the first time in 15 years, Karen would learn what it felt like to be powerless. What she didn't realize was that this moment, the moment she dismissed as trivial, would spread far beyond this single flight. It would echo in news headlines, flood social media feeds, and become a case study of how arrogance, prejudice, and entitlement can unravel in the span of a few minutes. The man sat quietly, only a few rows away from where his daughter huddled against her mother. From a distance, he didn't stand out. He wasn't dressed in flashy designer clothes. He wasn't loud or demanding. He looked like any other traveler, comfortable, composed, blending into the hum of the cabin. But appearances could be deceiving. His name was David Carter. To his employees, he was the visionary founder and CEO of one of the fastest-growing tech firms in the country. To his community, he was a philanthropist, a mentor, a man who had built success not just for himself but for others. And to his daughter, he was simply Daddy. The one who read bedtime stories even on nights when work consumed him. The one who promised her she could be anything she wanted to be. The one who made her feel safe in a world that often wasn't. David had grown up knowing what it meant to be underestimated. He wasn't born into wealth. His childhood was marked by long hours, a hard-working mother, and the unspoken lessons of racism that trailed him everywhere he went. He remembered the teacher who once told him he'd never make it past community college. He remembered the department store clerk who followed him down every aisle. He remembered the nights he studied by candlelight when the power had been shut off, whispering promises to himself that he would not let this cycle continue. He carried those memories with him into adulthood, not as scars, but as fuel. So when he built his company from the ground up, turning a small startup into a global name, he didn't just think about profits. He thought about dignity. About how many doors could be opened if someone like him had the chance to hold the keys. But tonight, on this flight, he wasn't the CEO. He wasn't the man in glossy magazine covers or on conference stages. He was a father, watching his little girl shrink into herself because someone in a position of authority decided she wasn't worthy of kindness. He felt the heat rise in his chest as he watched her tug at her sweater, shivering against the cold air. He saw the way her mother forced a smile, trying to pretend it didn't matter. He saw the way other passengers pretended to be busy with their phones, all too aware of what had just unfolded. David knew this wasn't just about a blanket. It was about his daughter learning a lesson far too early, that sometimes the world would treat her differently, cruelly, unfairly, for reasons that had nothing to do with who she was, but everything to do with how she looked. And he couldn't allow that. Not tonight. But David was a man of patience. He understood timing, strategy. He had built his life on knowing when to speak and when to wait. So he didn't leap to his feet right away. He didn't shout across the aisle or demand justice in the moment. Instead, he waited, letting the silence stretch, letting the arrogance of the attendant deepen her own mistake. Because when he did finally stand, his words would carry more weight than any angry outburst ever could. As he sat there watching, he remembered his own father's advice. Son, the world may try to strip you of your dignity. Don't ever hand it to them. Keep it. Guard it. And when the time is right, let your strength speak for itself. That advice echoed now as he folded his hands in his lap, steady, calm, resolute. His daughter needed more than just warmth. She needed to see that dignity could fight back, not with rage, but with power, with truth, with composure. And it all started with her decision to deny a little girl a blanket. He leaned slightly forward, catching the eye of a passenger across the aisle who had been watching the exchange. The man gave a small nod, as if to say, I saw it too. I know what happened. That silent acknowledgement told David what he already knew. The witnesses were ready. The truth would not be hidden. And when he rose, when he finally broke the silence, every eye on that plane would see the difference between arrogance and authority. Every child watching, whether in that cabin or through the stories that would later go viral, would see what it meant to stand tall in the face of prejudice. For now, though, David sat still. a man of patience, a father of principle, a leader who understood that some battles are won not in the heat of the moment, but in the silence before the storm. What the flight attendant didn't realize was that she hadn't just denied a little girl a blanket. She had set in motion a chain of events that would dismantle her arrogance and remind an entire plane what dignity looks like when it refuses to be denied. Minutes passed, but the cold lingered like an unwanted shadow. The little girl's lips quivered as she tried to pull her sweater higher around her shoulders. Her mother rubbed her arms, whispering comfort, but her eyes betrayed the sting of helplessness. The flight attendant returned to the aisle, pushing the beverage cart. Her expression was stiff, her chin slightly lifted, her steps deliberate. She avoided the family's row, eyes skating past them as if they didn't exist. When the cart stopped nearby, the mother gathered her courage and spoke again, her voice low but steady. "Excuse me. Please, just one blanket. She's freezing." Passengers leaned in, listening. The businessman across the aisle paused his typing. The young couple behind the family exchanged glances. This was no longer just about comfort. Everyone felt it. Karen stopped, her hands gripping the edge of the cart. She turned slowly, her smile thin and cold. "I told you already. We don't have extras. You should have thought about her comfort when you booked economy." The words cut through the cabin like shards of glass. Gasps rippled through the nearby rows. The little girl looked down at her lap, ashamed, though she had done nothing wrong. Her mother clenched her jaw, fighting back the urge to lash out. She knew the danger, how quickly black mothers could be labeled angry, how swiftly authority could turn against them if they dared to resist. The attendant leaned closer, her voice sharper now, dripping with disdain. "And if you keep pressing, I'll have to remind you of the rules about disrupting crew members. Do you want me to call the captain?" The threat hung in the air. A child's request had become a battleground. The audience, passengers, silent witnesses, felt the weight of it. Some muttered under their breath, others shifted uncomfortably. One woman whispered, "This is wrong." But still, no one intervened. The mother sat back, trembling, her hand resting protectively on her daughter's shoulder. Tears welled in the child's eyes, though she tried to blink them away. The humiliation was no longer subtle. It was loud, public, deliberate. And David Carter, her father, watched it all unfold. His jaw tightened, his patience thinning. He had stayed quiet, measuring the moment, but now the cruelty had escalated. His daughter wasn't just denied warmth. She was being shamed, threatened, diminished before an entire cabin of strangers. David's hand rested on the armrest, steady, controlled. He knew the moment was coming. He could feel the shift in the air, the way the tension in the cabin was coiling tighter with each second. Karen, oblivious to the storm she was provoking, smirked faintly as she turned back to her cart. To her, the battle was won. She had silenced the mother, humiliated the child, and reminded the cabin of who held authority here. But arrogance blinds. Because what she didn't see was David slowly rising from his seat. The movement was calm, deliberate, unhurried. Passengers noticed first, their eyes widening as they recognized the father's presence. Whispers fluttered like sparks. The little girl looked up, her tears meeting her father's steady gaze. In that instant, her posture shifted. She sat taller, reassured. Her father was here. Her father was standing. The cabin seemed to freeze, waiting for his words. And when he finally spoke, his voice was calm, measured, but filled with a quiet power that would change everything. The cabin was still. The hum of the engines faded beneath the weight of anticipation as David Carter rose to his feet. He wasn't hurried, he wasn't loud, but his presence seemed to shift the air itself. Dozens of eyes followed him as he stepped into the aisle, tall, composed, every movement deliberate. "Excuse me," he said evenly, his voice deep but calm, carrying easily over the murmurs. Karen turned, surprised. For a fraction of a second, her confidence faltered. But arrogance quickly returned, hardening her features. "Yes, sir? Can I help you?" David's gaze didn't waver. He didn't shout. He didn't point. He simply asked the question again, this time himself. My daughter is cold. May I have a blanket? The words were polite. Simple. Impossible to deny without revealing the cruelty already baked into her earlier refusal. Passengers leaned in, waiting, breath held. Karen's smile thinned. She glanced toward the galley, as if searching for backup. Then she folded her arms. As I've explained, we don't have any extras. You'll have to make do with what you have. Gasps rippled through the cabin. It was one thing to deny a child. But to look a grown man, calm, collected, commanding, in the eye and repeat the lie? That was arrogance of another level. David paused, letting her words hang. The silence stretched, heavy, uncomfortable. He looked at his daughter, shivering in her seat, then back at Karen. And then, with the same calm tone, he said words that pierced through the cabin like a blade. Very well. Then I'll ask the captain directly. Karen stiffened. A nervous laugh escaped her lips. Sir, that's not necessary. The captain is busy. But David was already reaching into his jacket pocket. Not for a phone, not for a ticket stub, but for a sleek black device that identified him instantly. His company's executive badge, embossed with gold lettering, one that airline staff were trained to recognize. The businessman across the aisle whispered, Wait, is that? Passengers craned their necks. Whispers turned into murmurs, and murmurs swelled into realization. This wasn't just another passenger. This was someone important. Someone powerful. David didn't flaunt the badge. He didn't wave it. He simply held it steady, his gaze never leaving Karen's. My name is David Carter. I'm the CEO of Carter Tech International. And unless my daughter has a blanket in the next 60 seconds, this conversation won't end here. It'll begin here. The shift was seismic. Karen's smug expression faltered. Her lips parted, her eyes flickered toward the front of the plane. For the first time that night, fear slipped through her mask. A hush swept the cabin. Passengers sat straighter, their eyes wide. Phones tilted subtly upward, cameras recording. The stage was set, and every second carried the weight of a verdict. Karen stammered. Yes, sir, I didn't mean. But David raised a hand gently, silencing her. His voice was steady, but his words struck like thunder. You embarrassed my child. You humiliated my wife. And you did it not because of policy, but because you thought you could. You thought no one would stand. Well, I'm standing. The little girl's eyes glistened, her small hands gripping the armrest as she watched her father reclaim her dignity with every word. And then, just as Karen opened her mouth to defend herself, the intercom crackled. Mr. Carter. The captain's voice rang out, clear and formal. This is your captain speaking. Please accept my personal apologies. A blanket will be brought to your family immediately. And rest assured this matter will be addressed. The cabin erupted in whispers, then applause, soft at first, then swelling, a ripple of validation that swept through every row. Karen froze. Her authority evaporated in an instant. The uniform that had shielded her arrogance moments ago now felt like a costume stripped of power. She stood there, trembling, her face pale. Another flight attendant rushed forward, blanket in hand, laying it gently over the girl's shoulders. The little girl's eyes widened as warmth finally wrapped around her. But more than the blanket, it was her father's calm strength that warmed her most. David thanked the attendant with a nod, then turned back to Karen. His voice was quiet, but every passenger heard it. Power isn't given by a uniform. It's earned by respect. And tonight you showed none. Karen's lips trembled. No words came. For the first time, she looked small, diminished, a shadow of the authority she once wielded. David sat back down, pulling his daughter close. She leaned into him, comforted not just by the blanket, but by the assurance that her dignity mattered. That she was not invisible. That she was worthy of care. The applause swelled again, echoing down the aisle, bouncing off the cabin walls. Some passengers even stood, clapping, nodding toward the family. Phones captured the moment, knowing it would not stay confined to this flight. Karen turned away, her steps faltering as she disappeared into the galley. But the damage was done. Her arrogance had been dismantled in front of an entire plane. And soon, the world outside this cabin would know the story too. Because passengers weren't just watching. They were recording. And within hours, the humiliation she had inflicted on a child would become the humiliation she faced before millions. The flight landed hours later, but the real turbulence was only beginning. By the time passengers stepped off the plane, several videos had already hit the internet. Clips of Karen's smug refusal. The moment David revealed who he was. The captain's voice over the intercom. And most powerful of all, the applause that filled the cabin when a little girl finally got her blanket. On TikTok, one video gained 1 million views in under an hour. Twitter threads dissected every detail. This wasn't just about a blanket, one user wrote. It was about dignity. About bias. About the arrogance of power. Others weren't as measured. Fire her immediately. Name the airline. We deserve to know. Imagine humiliating a child because of her skin color. Disgusting. The hashtags trended by sunrise. Hashtag blanketgate. Hashtag flyfair. Hashtag justice for the Carter girl. Clips made their way to morning shows. Anchors shook their heads in disbelief. Panelists debated, was this isolated misconduct, or a symptom of deeper prejudice in the airline industry? David Carter's name trended alongside the company he built, Carter Tech International. Stock analysts noted that his quiet, commanding presence on the plane had actually boosted investor sentiment. Here is a CEO. One headline read, who doesn't just talk about values in boardrooms, he lives them. The airline, meanwhile, scrambled to contain the wildfire. By mid-morning, it issued a statement. We are aware of an incident involving one of our crew members. We take allegations of misconduct seriously and have launched an immediate investigation. We deeply regret any distress caused to the Carter family and our valued passengers. But apologies in corporate language rarely satisfy an outraged public. The comments beneath the post flamed with fury. Investigation? We all saw the video. Stop with the PR spin and show accountability. Would you be investigating if he weren't a billionaire CEO? The backlash grew so intense that within hours, the airline was forced to suspend Karen pending review. Her name leaked online, her photos plastered across feeds. Some voices called for mercy, saying no one deserved internet humiliation. But most were unmoved, pointing out the humiliation had started with her, and with a child. Inside the Carter home, things were quieter but no less charged. David's daughter scrolled through clips of herself on the flight, the blanket around her shoulders. She saw strangers defending her, lifting her dignity higher than she could have imagined the night before. Daddy, she whispered. People, they care. David knelt beside her. They care because you matter. And you always will. For him, this wasn't about viral fame or corporate optics. It was about teaching his daughter that her worth could never be dictated by the biases of others. Still, the ripple effects spread further. Civil rights groups reached out, using the incident as a rallying cry to push for stronger anti-bias training in airlines. Politicians tweeted about passenger rights. Celebrities weighed in, amplifying the story to millions more. What had begun as a cruel denial of a simple blanket was now a national conversation. About race. About respect. About who feels welcome at 35,000 feet, and who doesn't. The airline's stock dipped in after-hours trading. Lawsuits were whispered about. Crisis PR teams worked overtime. But no spin could erase the raw, unfiltered footage spreading across every platform. And in every clip, the same image endured, a father, standing calmly but firmly, reclaiming his daughter's dignity in front of the world. The shockwaves weren't just corporate. They were cultural. People saw themselves in that little girl. People saw their own fathers, brothers, or mothers in David. And people saw, too, the cold familiarity of Karen's smirk, the face of bias, arrogance, and unchecked authority. In coffee shops, offices, and classrooms, the story was retold, debated, and analyzed. Some said David's CEO status gave him power others wouldn't have had. Others countered that his composure, not his title, was what truly dismantled the injustice. But no one could deny one thing: the story had struck a nerve. By nightfall, #Justice for the Carter Girl had crossed 10 million mentions worldwide. The Carter family hadn't asked for the spotlight, but now they carried a torch for something larger than themselves. And as David tucked his daughter into bed that evening, pulling the very blanket from the flight gently over her shoulders, he whispered, "Sleep well, my love. The world saw you. And it listened." She smiled softly, her small hand resting on his. "Because of you, Daddy." David shook his head. "Because of us." The story of a child, a blanket, and a father's calm defiance didn't just end with trending hashtags or corporate apologies. It lingered in the hearts of millions because it revealed something raw, something universal. At its core, this wasn't about airline policy. It wasn't about customer service. It was about dignity. The dignity of an innocent child who deserved kindness. The dignity of a parent who refused to let arrogance strip that away. And the dignity of every person who has ever felt small in the face of bias but longed for someone to stand up and say, "Enough." David Carter never raised his voice. He didn't trade cruelty for cruelty. He showed the world that the greatest power isn't wealth, or status, or even authority. It's composure. It's courage. It's the refusal to let hate write the final chapter. The lesson is simple, but not easy. Racism often disguises itself in small acts: a denied blanket, a dismissive tone, a smirk that says, "You don't belong here." But those small acts carry weight. They wound, they humiliate, and they remind the oppressed that the world isn't always fair. Yet, in the same way, small acts of resistance can transform everything. A father stepping forward. A plane of passengers applauding. Millions of strangers demanding better. That is how change begins. And so this story becomes more than just one family's experience. It becomes a mirror. It asks us, what would you have done if you were there? Would you have spoken up? Would you have stayed silent? Would you have clapped? We may never sit on that exact flight, but we face these choices every day, in classrooms, offices, sidewalks, and checkout lines. Each moment of injustice asks us the same question: will you let it pass, or will you push back with courage and grace? For the Carter family, the answer came through one man's steady voice and one little girl's quiet strength. For the rest of us, the answer is still being written. The world doesn't need more silence. It needs more witnesses who become allies, more bystanders who become protectors, and more fathers, mothers, sisters, and brothers who rise to say, "Not today. Not here. Not ever again." So if this story moved you, don't let it fade like last week's news cycle. Carry it. Share it. Talk about it. Stand taller the next time you see someone diminished. Be the voice that turns the tide. Because justice isn't an event. It's a choice, repeated over and over again, until dignity is no longer denied to anyone. This is more than a story about a blanket. It's a reminder. The smallest acts of cruelty can cut deeply, but the smallest acts of courage can heal the world. If you believe that too, don't just watch. Join us. Subscribe. Share. And above all, choose dignity. Always.